Hello everyone, thanks for showing up here to Meadowside Gardening. I just wanted to take a little bit of time very early in the season right now to come back to a little thing I did several years ago, probably about 4 years ago now I'd say, where I decided to make some shallow, low-level berms in the landscape right next to my raised beds, or what used to be raised beds, and that would be to hold water back in the landscape. You see, my area around here used to be an old farm field, and if you look out in the distance, it's basically hilled in the center. It's a long stretch with two ditches going up either side of the property. And those two ditches, when the snow melts, those two ditches allow all that water that is up further upslope towards the back there, comes rushing down here and simply exits out the property and into the field next door. So what I did is I created these low berms along the ditch lines here so that I could hold back the water in the landscape and help hydrate the landscape and take advantage of all the runoff and snow melt here in the springtime. So now just over here right next to my garden beds, I've kept this one set of raised beds along the length of my spruce trees that are running along the south side of the garden beds in order to use that as a bank to hold back the water that's collecting here underneath my spruce trees. And right over there, the bank rises up into my neighboring property over there, my neighbor's property. And so right now, I've got this shallow pond that's full of water. And as the land and the ground thaws, this water has a chance now to just sink down into the ground, hydrating the landscape. And in this area, I'm slightly raised up, and the landscape kind of slopes down that way towards the far end and the far side of the property and the garden over there. And so what will happen is, by hydrating the ground here, this water can now just sink and then travel as an underground flow down and hydrate the garden further down slope that way. And that's a really good thing for this garden and in this landscape because, as I mentioned earlier, although this was previously a farmer's field, actually it was a single horse and plow farm field, and this is all sitting on sand, and I'm sitting up here on a ridge line that eventually heads down towards the river. So this landscape tends to dry out pretty significantly, and at least it always used to, because basically all the water just ran off the property. So now what's happening is, underneath these spruce trees, I've got a small pond, and that's going to sit here for the springtime, and eventually it's going to sink down into the ground and it's going to disappear. But I don't have just one berm. I've got several berms, and I've run them up the side of my property, and I've made a few, well, basically several, all the way up that little ditch area. I have the same thing going on the other side of the property as well. And as you can see, just with the little dips and bumps in the landscape, I am holding and collecting water here in the landscape. And if I go up here, right up next to the garden bed, it's all backed up. And interestingly enough, the water's actually flowing. So the water is being held back, and it's forming these little ponds here. So I've got another little berm here, and eventually it gets up over the berm and spills out and continues on its way down the pathway here. But for a little while up here, I'm going to have another little puddle pond here. And got another one here. Put in some soil, made a small berm here. Got another puddle. I have an old lilac plant here, and then the garden bed over here was raised up, so here's another long berm and another puddle. And that pretty much goes on up the path there. I also, over here, here's the ditch that's alongside the old farm field. And try to get through here. And that goes up along the tree line here between some pine trees and spruce trees and what used to be a rock wall, but got filled in with leaves, and they've composted down, so now that's a berm leaning up against a rock wall on the far side of the property. But coming up into kind of my neighboring property here, what that's created with that rock wall and berm over here is now all the snow melt from up there is coming down this way, and I've got it running down into my property, which is fantastic because, as I said, I'm sitting on a bed of sand, and the more water I can get held back in the landscape, the more hydrated my landscape will be as the spring thaws continue, and the better off my garden, excuse the wind, the better off my garden is going to be as a result. So all of that water is now being held back in the landscape, and it's going to be contained. The largest storage container for water that you could ever have in a permaculture environment is literally the landscape itself. So water management is one of those major principles and aspects of permaculture gardening, and what I'm doing here, which is no-till gardening. And it's what I use so that I no longer have to water my plants all through the summer months. I don't experience drought here anymore. Even when our region has had severe droughts, this landscape has always remained hydrated. And with this carbon blanket of mulch, the soil stays hydrated and it never dries out. So I just wanted to come through here, take a little bit of a walk, and show you literally with just berms of just a few inches high in a near level landscape, the sheer volume of water that could be held back in the landscape to hydrate the soil. It's just phenomenal. And I can now look forward to yet one more year where I have no watering. I don't have to do any watering whatsoever, except to water in the transplants and make sure they get firmly established. So, yeah, gotta love it. Easy work with a massive, massive benefit. Alright, so here's a perfect example of a lot of water running through the landscape, and all the water that's running down this little ditch on the edge of the property is just flowing the water down along this edge, which is luckily held back by a shallow berm that's on the far side of that set of spruce trees there. So I'm holding back water in the landscape here because if I didn't do that, all of this water would just run right off the property. That's a huge loss for me. Just look at it go. And yeah, so I have this black plastic down actually to smother the weeds. It's all I had. I didn't have any more leaves to do the cover and smother because what I want to do is on the other side of this fence is to run a ditch or cut a little slot in the ground, and I'm going to put in a permanent physical barrier along the garden edge there, and that way I can actually do the full border of this garden, which I haven't been able to do before. And so what happened is all the grass and the crabgrass and the sorrels and stuff just came right on over. It was coming on over into the garden, was coming on over into the fruit orchard, and it was, well, it's kind of just disheartening to do all the work of the cover and the smother and then realize that without having that border in, I mean, no matter how much I wish it weren't so, the weeds will invade and take advantage of this nutrient-rich soil. So, hey, now I got to go back and do the work and put in the physical barrier and make sure that I no longer have to deal with all the weeds coming in. So saying, it's worked pretty good everywhere else. I just got to make sure I get those borders in finally. This is what's going to be a major project this year. So, yeah. Now I just got to wait for this water to drain out.